This is session 5 of our series on how we got our Bible. And again, thanks are due to David Ewart for his book, A General Introduction to the Bible from Ancient Tablets to Modern Translations. Here we will be examining the text of the Old Testament. It would be wonderful if we could point to some ancient scrolls and say, "Here's the book of Genesis, written by Moses and signed with his own hand." But we all know that that copy, along with all the autographed copies of the various Old Testament books, has long since crumbled into dust. What would we expect? Those copies, like a child's favorite teddy bear, were handled, carried about, and loved to death. For any of these ancient manuscripts, we can blame their loss on time, wear, and catastrophe. When you look at a timeline, it's easy to see how impractical actual preservation would be. The books of the Old Testament were composed as early as the 15th century BC. That would be books like Genesis or Job, or as late as the 5th, 1,000 years later. That would be 2nd Chronicles or Malachi. In order to get past the ages of manuscript, copied from manuscript, cycle after cycle, we have to come down to 1453. That you recognize as the age of printing. The wonder of movable type, invented by the Chinese, was turned by Johann Gutenberg and a crowd of like-minded entrepreneurs into a revolution in information. This long after that revolution, we might not realize how profoundly it changed our world. We think of computers with their digitization of everything, and of the smartphones that put the riches of the internet just a click or a swipe away. But if you really think about it, Gutenberg Press changed the world. No longer did we have to depend on the labor and skill of generations of monks to produce copies of important books. No longer did we have to worry about the time, the cost, and the risk of copying errors that plagued the literary world for centuries. After 1453, we could know that a book once set in type could be reproduced in the thousands, and that every single copy would be absolutely identical. But before printing, we had manuscript copies, all made by hand. The centuries bore heavy on them, and they were vulnerable to the events of history. Fires struck in the libraries. Flood and earthquake took their toll. Invading armies pillaged and destroyed. Imagine the priests trying to preserve the sacred books when Nebuchadnezzar laid Jerusalem waste in 586 BC, or when the Romans did the same in AD 70, and these are only a couple of the many from history. It's only through God's providence that some copies survived. Our scholars lamented that none of their manuscripts were older than the 9th century AD. That would be almost 1,500 years after, say, Malachi put up his stylus and blotted the last word of his prophecy. The fact that we had even these manuscripts could be credited to the Carolingian Renaissance. Not, of course, the real Renaissance of the 13th, 14th, and 15th centuries. This was that earlier flowering of culture under the benevolent hand of Charlemagne. We may think of him as the warrior king who strove to rebuild the lost Roman Empire, and indeed he did manage to unite most of Europe under his reign. But he was also a scholar who knew how much of the knowledge and culture of the Greeks and Romans was vanishing. He commissioned scholars to search out old manuscripts from libraries, monasteries, and churches, and make copies of them before they were lost forever. and we owe the preservation of many literary treasures of Greece and Rome to that effort. And to be sure, many of the manuscripts reproduced by his people were biblical ones. And what about all those centuries before Charlemagne? Well, until recently we had almost no copies of Old Testament books that were older. Calamities like flood, fire, earthquake, invading armies, and simple neglect had done their work. Then, as most of us know, 1947 changed that. A Bedouin boy throwing rocks at cave entrances over the Dead Sea heard one rock shatter some pottery, and his curiosity brought to light what we call the Dead Sea Scrolls. Found in several caves were manuscripts dating back to perhaps 100 BC, a full 1,000 years older than the ones we had. Among these were examples of every Old Testament book except Esther. Most were only in fragmentary form, with significant portions missing, but the finds were still a treasure beyond our expectations. But shouldn't we have had at least some biblical manuscripts from those in-between centuries? After all, they were the sacred books of the Jews and ought to have been lovingly preserved. But a weird combination of piety and practicality was to blame for this lack of copies. Those biblical manuscripts were indeed treasured by the Jews, until they began to be worn. It didn't seem right to them that a sacred text should become tattered and smudged. So when this began to happen, they made a copy of it and placed the obsolete copy in a storeroom in the synagogue, a room they called the Geniza. There, the old manuscripts accumulated. When the Geniza started to fill up, they removed the scrolls and buried them with ritual respect. If you think of how we treat an American flag that has become faded or threadbare, you will understand why they had to dispose of pages like this reverently. Well, then, we do have some manuscripts, though not as many as we'd like. Given all those years of manual copying, we would expect some errors to have crept in, and so they did. Here are the kinds of slips that did occur. The Hebrew letters for R and N differ chiefly in that the N has a bottom horizontal stroke. Remember the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar? That's how we all learned to spell his name, right? But we know from other records that the proper spelling was with an R, Nebuchadrezzar. Picture a scribe with a headache, and his stylus slips a little on the Hebrew R, making a slight bottom horizontal mark. Suddenly, it's an N. Could happen to anyone. In the same way, a moment's inattention could result in a letter omitted, or in a letter doubled. And then there are Hebrew numbers. Unlike our system, which we got from Arabic, with specific symbols standing for numerical digits, the Hebrew language just used letters from their alphabet to represent numbers. A given number, then, would just appear as a single Hebrew letter. And with the words running together without spaces, that's how they wrote them early on, it would be easy to miss the number altogether. If you look at 1 Samuel 13:1 in the New International Version, you'll see that Saul was blank years old. A scribe missed the letter that stood for his age. There have also been a few cases that we might call slips of the eye. There's a famous example from the New Testament. In John 17, Jesus' prayer, we read, "My prayer is not that you take them from the world, but that you keep them from the evil one." But if we look at the Greek text, the phrase ek tu, from, appears twice, with the second just below the first. Blink at the wrong moment, and your eye slips down a line. Then you wind up writing, "My prayer is not that you take them from the evil one." Oops. But in fact it is remarkable how very few such errors are. After all, the copyists went to extraordinary lengths to avoid them. Here's a set of rules that they developed over the years. First, the parchment they used could only come from clean animals. No pigskin, for example. Then, each page could have between 48 and 60 lines of text, no more and no less. And each page had to be lined before they began to write, guaranteeing that the lines of text would be uniform. Only black ink could be used, and that only from the official formula. The scribe was to pronounce each word before writing it. Imagine how noisy the scriptorium would be. And before writing God's sacred name, the scribe must wipe his pen. Even when the page was finished, it wasn't done. A review was to be done, and if any page had more than 3 errors, it had to be destroyed and redone from scratch. That review also involved counting the number of words on the page, and even the number of letters. And unlike our habit of writing, where some of us print and some use cursive, and cursive varies from person to person, the forms of the Hebrew letters, and even the size of the spaces, were all regularized. Now, of course, these rules and practices developed over a long period, and we know some of the chief contributions scholars made. There was the Talmudic period. The term comes from the Hebrew limud, meaning to study. It covers from about 200 to 500 AD, and was marked by the concern of the rabbis that Hebrew might be lost. Jews had been scattered by persecution, and even forbidden for a while to live in Jerusalem, and many were adopting the languages of the countries where they settled. During this time, the so-called Talmud was produced. The dictionary says it is, quote, a record of rabbinic discussions pertaining to Jewish law, ethics, customs, and history. In effect, it was a commentary on the Old Testament, collected from oral tradition and loosely organized, but a commentary nonetheless. There were, in fact, 2 schools of rabbis, in Babylonia and Palestine, and so 2 versions of the Talmud arose. For our purposes, the Talmudic scholars made 2 major contributions to the Hebrew text. First, they inserted word divisions. The original text had none, but was what scholars call scripta continua. A native speaker can generally make sense of written text without word divisions, but among Jews scattered over Europe and knowing Hebrew only as their second language, this was a real problem. It can even cause some confusion for us who know English. What does this mean? Is it God is now here, or God is nowhere? We too can profit from having spaces between the words. The Talmudic rabbis also separated the sacred text into sections or paragraphs for use in public reading. As is true in denominations that follow the liturgical year, doing readings from Scripture on specified days, so the synagogues did, and the designated reader might not be well versed in Hebrew. Knowing where to begin and end a reading would avoid embarrassment. The next period to affect our text was the Masoretic, from about AD 500 to 1000. The word may come from the Hebrew masar, to hand down, and this is in fact how they saw their mission, to hand down a text unchanged but easily understood. They made several contributions to that end. First, although they could not make any change in the text, there was always the margin area. And during this period, the Masoretic scribes inserted some 1,300 notes into the margin, defining an archaic word or cross-referencing something. Those of us with study Bibles will find this a familiar pattern. And that rule about not touching the text itself was bent in a very few cases. For example, the rabbis winced at having to write or read the names of pagan deities in the sacred text. Here and there, a scribe might substitute a euphemism. For Baal or Molech or Ashtoreth, they'd put in the word boshet, shame. Fortunately for the integrity of the text, though, only some of the manuscripts show these quirks. We haven't lost the original reading. Last, we find that a very few places in the text were just too embarrassing for the rabbis to leave untouched. Here's one. Judges 18:30 says, "There the Danites set up for themselves the idols, and Jonathan, son of Gershom, the son of Moses, and his sons were priests." Oh my! So the people of Dan, sliding into idolatry, appointed priests to their pagan gods, and one of them was a grandson of Moses? How could such a thing be? But it's in the text, and we can't change it. But wait, the name Moses, if it had one more letter, could be Manasseh, and that name suggests the wicked king of Judah from years later. Maybe if we put a letter above the text, then the public reader can have an alternative, and we can, so to speak, save the text from embarrassing itself. We might have done without these last two kinds of enhancements, but there is one that has proven of great value. You see, as the rabbis saw the knowledge of Hebrew continuing to dwindle among their people, they knew that just having word divisions was not enough. The Hebrew alphabet had no vowels, and that left too much room for ambiguity. Even for native speakers, the absence of vowels can still cause trouble. Suppose I showed you the word PN. Would that mean pin, pine, pen, pun, pan, pain? We could sort it out with context, of course, as in pour the batter into the PN. But then, English is our language. Jews struggling with just a slight knowledge of Hebrew could be lost. So the rabbis came up with vowels, but they couldn't put them into the text. Their overriding rule was that it must be preserved without changes. And so they put markings to represent the vowels under the text, like this. Under the aleph, there, the two dots are a long A. The inverted triangle of dots under the bet is a short E. Under the he, that single dot is the long E sound. A tiny T shape is a broad A, and the dot above the letter is O. Ambiguity is removed, and the text stays unchanged. Beautiful. The result was the famous Masoretic text, which became the standard Hebrew text for 1,000 years. Oh yes, the introduction of vowel points had one very curious unintended effect. It created the word Jehovah. As most of us know, The sacred name of God, as Jews understand it, is Yahweh. It's spelled with these 4 letters, the so-called Tetragrammaton, and observant Jews have always been concerned not to misuse that name. One of the 10 Commandments pronounces guilt on anyone who takes the name in vain. What then about reading the Scriptures aloud in the synagogue? Might the reader be guilty of a poor attitude or simple inattention and become guilty of speaking the sacred name in vain? Their solution, of course, was not to say it at all. Whenever the name appeared in the text, the reader was to say Adonai instead. That was, after all, another of God's names, and it was not forbidden to pronounce it. It seems, then, that the scribes came up with a reminder for the reader. They would place the vowel points for Adonai under the Tetragrammaton, thus signaling him to say Adonai. Here's what we have: the 4-letter word for Yahweh, but the vowel points for Adonai. Once again, the sacred text has not been changed, but the reader should know not to say Yahweh. However, some of the earlier translators must not have realized what was going on here. They simply saw a Hebrew word with vowel points and saw that it would be pronounced Yehovah, and that went into their translations of the Scripture. So the word Jehovah was born. Now notice, that was not intended to be a new word, nor was it supposed to be pronounced as written. It was only a reminder to the reader. So then, Jehovah was not intended to be a word, and never was. It's an innocent translator's error. One wonders if the Jehovah's Witnesses know. Well, among our manuscripts of the Hebrew Old Testament, there are some that are especially valuable and well known. There is the Cairo Codex, containing the major and minor prophets, and dating from A.D. 895. The Aleppo Codex originally contained the complete Old Testament. It's from a little later, A.D. 930. Then there's the British Museum Codex, which originally contained the Pentateuch, the 5 books of Moses, but now we have only Genesis 39:20 through Deuteronomy 1:33. It dates from AD 950. Notice that full column of marginal notes there. There is also the Leningrad Codex, with the complete Old Testament, from AD 1008. As you can see, it was handsomely illustrated. Another codex, also associated with its preservation in Leningrad, is this one, containing the latter prophets. Dating from AD 916, we can probably thank the Carolingian Renaissance for this one, too. And last, we have the Reuchlin Codex, containing the prophets. It was produced in AD 1105, and it carries the name of Johann Reuchlin, the scholar who edited and published it in the 1500s. These are famous manuscripts that have been known and used for many years. But there have been recent discoveries as well. Our sole relic from biblical times for a while was the Nash Papyrus, which is dated to about 150 B.C. It turned up in Egypt in 1898. Only a single page, it contains just the 10 Commandments and the Shema, that is, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." At around the same time, though, Egypt gave up another treasure, the Cairo Geniza, which was explored in 1896. You will recall that the Geniza was a repository of worn-out manuscripts, and this one was a bonanza. Solomon Schechter took over the task of cataloging, studying, and publishing its contents, and it became his entire life's work. And we all know the famous Dead Sea Scrolls. After that Bedouin boy stumbled on a few of them in 1947, searchers eventually discovered some 1,000 documents or portions of them. All of the Old Testament is represented among these, with the exception only of Esther. Well, before leaving this subject, let's look at what one of these manuscripts had to go through in order to survive and wind up in one of our museums or libraries today. Here's the Aleppo Codex, which has had a remarkable history. Prepared in Israel, in Tiberias, in AD 930, many scholars consider it to be the finest Old Testament manuscript in existence. After about a century, it was relocated to Jerusalem, AD 1040, and placed in the care of the Karaite sect of the Jews. That no doubt seemed a good idea at the time, but it soon turned bad. The knights of the First Crusade, here to liberate the Holy Land from the infidels, seized Jerusalem, and when they did, they liberated quite a few things, including some ancient manuscripts, and the Aleppo was among them. Desperate to reclaim their priceless document, the Jews borrowed money wherever they could and ransomed it from the Crusaders. And realizing it would not be safe in Israel, the Karaite Jews took it with them to Fustat in the Egyptian Delta region. That was in 1099. After about 300 years, though, it moved again, this time to a large synagogue in Aleppo, Syria, around 1400. Since it remained there for 600 years, it has ever since been called the Aleppo Codex. But the currents of history caught it again in 1947. That was the year that the Jews reestablished the State of Israel, and fury at them throughout the Arab world boiled over. Rioters in Aleppo trashed and burned the synagogue, and the precious manuscript seemed to have been lost in the chaos. Lost. And then found. A decade later, 1957, the manuscript reappeared. It was damaged and much of it was missing. And then we see some international intrigue. The Jews smuggled it out of Syria by way of Turkey and returned it to Jerusalem. It resides today in Israel's Shrine of the Book. It has only 294 of its original 490 pages now. Most of the Pentateuch is gone, with only its last 11 pages still in place. The last few pages of the Codex are also gone, as are a few pages from the prophets. A recent author has had this to say about the Aleppo. What happened to the Codex between its post-riot rescue in 1947 and 1957, when it was smuggled out of Syria? Where was it secreted? Were some leaves or fragments stolen? Were some in the possession of rioters? Were portions of the Codex burnt in the riots? What other pages or parts of pages are still out there? Whether in the hands of Jews or Syrians, we cannot know. It is now 60 years since rioters savaged the crown of Aleppo, but the search for the remaining pages continues. The search for those pages and for other possible manuscripts goes on. The Hebrew text is in very good shape, but we always hope for more and better clues. Those of us who value the Scriptures know that we should stay tuned.